This is the Kestrel Country Podcast, where we discuss the people, places, and events all around Kestrel Country. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Kestrel Country Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Church, joined as always by my lovely wife and co-host, Catherine.
Hello, hello.
We got James in the studio too. James, can you say hi?
Hi.
James sitting in on this one.
Yep.
Yeah, it's feeling a little more like spring out there.
It is. It feels like spring rain instead of winter rain. It's very different.
Yeah. No, it's feeling a lot like spring around our place right now, too.
The hyacinths are popping up. And if you don't, that's one thing. The deer do not eat the hyacinths.
Nice. That's why we have them.
It's a win.
Yeah. Well, and we've got spring chicks right now.
We do. We've got baby lambs. 3 baby lambs joined.
Spring baby lambs.
Yep.
That was quite the excitement around our place this last week.
The girls, well, specifically Ida was requesting them for her birthday. And then thanks to our friends, the Bunches, we got connected with some baby lambs that need to be bottle fed.
From the U of I.
Yep.
Bummer lambs.
Yep.
Yep.
So it's perfect because the kids get to go feed them. But it was a learning curve for all of us on how to get them to eat.
Yeah. Thanks to our neighbor, Jeremy Bunch, for coming over and helping us get them going on the bottles. Now they're feeding like champs.
Yep.
But I have to say, it's pretty awesome to bottle feed a little baby lamb.
It's pretty cute.
It's pretty fun.
Yep.
Yeah. We're having a lot of fun with that. So feels like spring. And this week, we've got a fun episode with Ellis Eifert of Eifert Law here in
just
Moscow,
you
Idaho.
on this one interviewing Ellis.
Yeah, old friends. Been friends since college
Yep.
with Ellis, and he's got his own law firm here now. So we discussed a whole bunch of stuff. What I found very interesting, hopefully will be really helpful to a lot of people, around some of the legal aspects of real estate, and particularly how do you control your estate, both real estate and the rest of your property, when you're no longer in control, whether that be death or incapacitation. So it's something that people maybe don't think about a lot, but really is really important. And I think Ellis did a great job of explaining why that's important and what to do. So,
Well, I'm excited to listen to it.
yeah, well, let's get right into it
Yeah.
with Ellis Eifert.
I ended up really liking the more contractual or transactional side of it. And that's where I ended up deciding I wanted to do estate planning. Honestly, was my second year of law school.
Okay.
So, when I got done, I was never really interested in having a court practice. That was never something I was interested in. I've been in court a few times. I've had a couple of, I actually have even had one bench trial that I did, but we settled halfway through. So I'm not a court attorney. So, if someone has an issue with litigation, I refer that out. But
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. So going back a little further, you grew up in Mississippi.
Yes, I did.
Then
Born and raised.
How did you end up in Moscow, Idaho?
So that's a funny story. So I grew up in Mississippi. My family has been in Mississippi since 1804.
Really?
So we are pretty deeply rooted in that state.
I thought we were long-term Michigan people. We're like mid-1800s in Michigan. But
I mean,
that's amazing.
I assume for Michigan, that's about as far back as you go, given when it became a state. And the same thing with Mississippi, like that my family settled there in 1804. One of my ancestors, John McCaleb Geralt, they were Huguenots in France. And after St. Bartholomew's Eve, they went to England, then moved to Amherst County, Virginia, then went to Indiana and fought in the Revolutionary War. And my ancestor actually served with Daniel Boone. So he and Daniel Boone were actually both the two lieutenants to George Rogers Clark's brother, who I can never remember his name, but George Rogers Clark's brother was in the Revolutionary War, and anyway, so then after the war, the U.S. government gave him a bunch of land near Natchez, Mississippi.
Wow.
And they moved down there, and they had a plantation until Sherman came through, and then they didn't have a plantation anymore, and then they just lived around Natchez, Mississippi, Port Gibson, Mississippi, Vicksburg.
Wow.
And so we go pretty far back in Mississippi. The reason I ended up out here was my dad actually had subscribed to Credenda Agenda back in the day, and heard about New St. Andrews College. I wanted to go to Ole Miss. I had a couple buddies who were in a fraternity up there. They were like, if you want to come, we can get you in the fraternity. I wanted to go to Ole Miss. All my family had all gone to Ole Miss back in the day, including my dad. Actually, he went to Ole Miss med school. But my dad said, that sounds fine. You can do that, but you're going to pay for college. If you don't want to pay for college, why don't you go to this little school in North Idaho? And so here I am.
I had a very similar conversation with my parents. That's funny.
Yeah. I don't. You don't argue with the money. So here I am. So I came up here in 2004, and I went to New St. Andrews College, and I met my wife Hope there. We were in the same class.
Some people are going to find this story boring, but I thought it was fascinating that you drove up from Mississippi in an F-150.
Yes.
A gorgeous old body style F-150, by the way.
And I still have it.
That was from Idaho, right?
Yes. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So my swim coach, I swam competitively for a while before high school and a little bit during high school. And my swim coach, Chris Ingledow, is from Kamiah, Idaho. And he went to U of I. He swam on U of I's swim team. And somehow ended up in Meridian, Mississippi. And I ended up buying his truck, which they buy out of Lewiston, and then drove back up here in it. And actually, Chris is back in Lewiston now.
Oh, that's funny.
I ran into him not that long ago.
And you still have the truck?
I still have the truck. It's parked in my driveway right now full of trash that I have to take to the dump. So
that's awesome.
Yeah.
That's funny. So then you graduated from NSA, and what made you want to get into law school?
So, another story. Yeah. So what made me get into law school was just, I don't know. So I was thinking about going to medical school, and I get down to it. It was somewhere between junior and senior year, and like beginning of senior year of college. And I was thinking about it. I was like, I don't actually want to go to medical school. And then I had no idea what I was going to do. So I was like, I don't know what I'm going to do. I was kind of thinking about just going and working. I'd worked for the Forest Service in college. And if you fight fires with the Forest Service, you can make a good bit of money during the summer. And so I was thinking, I could go fight fires and then ski during the winter and just, I don't know, just be a ski bum during the winter. Yeah. But my mom mentioned, she's like, you thought about going to law school? And I was like, no, I hadn't. And I had been dating my now wife at the time. And we were talking, and I made some comment about, I think we had just gotten engaged actually. And I was thinking about law school at the time, and we had gotten engaged, and I think I said something along the lines of like, well, we don't have to, I thinking about law school, but, why don't we could go up to Leavenworth, Washington, which is where I worked. I could fight fire, I think I floated the idea of us living in a van on the station, and as you can imagine, that didn't go over super well. And she's like, "Well, how about you go to grad school instead?" So I went to grad school. So I went to law school. I showed up to law school. I had no idea what I was getting. I had no idea what I was getting into. It was kind of a whim that providentially worked out, but it wasn't. I wouldn't recommend anyone go the route I went to get into law, which was I have nothing better to do, so I'll do more school, which is a terrible idea. Just for me, it happened to work out. So I showed up at law school, no idea, jump into class. I have no idea what's happening. So I get through my 1L year, thankfully, and then I actually really enjoyed it, and and I made it through. I graduated, I survived, and here I am.
And then did you come right back to Moscow? after?
Yeah, we did.
Law school?
So we moved back here after law school. So when I graduated, it was in 2011, which, according to the American Bar Association at the time, was the worst year to graduate from law school since they've been keeping records.
Interesting.
Because everything with the financial downturn had kind of, I mean, there's a bunch of associates who've been forced out of large firms who had, 3 to 6 years experience, and they were all getting let go. I show up, I'm not, I have no experience. You don't have any experience when you graduate from law school. You don't really know how to practice any of that stuff. And so then good luck when things are tight and they're trying to get someone who can actually start producing. And I come up and like, hey, I'd like to work at this entry-level associate job. And then someone who's got 5 years experience is like, I'd like to do the same thing. By the way, I've been doing it for 5 years. I mean, who are you going to pick? So we ended up back here. I took the bar. I worked as a financial advisor for a while. And then I just eventually started my own practice. I don't know if you know Eric Eisinger.
I know the name.
So he married Matt Rice, Dr. Rice.
Yeah.
So Eric married one of Matt's nieces. Okay. So the Rices that live down in Tri-Cities.
Oh yeah. Okay.
I had a conversation with Eric at a wedding up here, and I was talking to him about it, and he was like, "You should just do it." So I was like, "All right, I'll just do it." So I started my own firm in 2012, but I kind of had it, but I didn't do much with it.
10 years, man.
Yeah, 10
That's
years.
Awesome.
I did some stuff with it, not a ton, but 2014 is when I officially, I was like, all right, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to really start focusing on law, and I'm going to transition to not just kind of doing both. So that's, yeah. So then started the firm and started practicing, and I've been, practicing since 2012 in some sense, but since 2014, that's what I've been doing.
Yeah.
Pretty much completely.
And it's just you.
Just me. Yep. Nice. I'm a solo practitioner. I've got some support staff, but I'm the only attorney. So,
cool.
Yep.
Yeah. How does that, and you focus on estate planning?
Yes.
Is that mostly?
That's mostly what I do.
It?
Yeah, that's mostly what I do. I do estate plan. I mean, allegedly I do estate planning, business law, and real estate. I do some business law. I do a little bit of real estate, but it's primarily estate planning. So estate planning, probate. That's my main focus. That's what I really enjoyed in law school, and that's what I really enjoy doing now. Honestly, it's my favorite thing to do.
What do you enjoy about it?
So I enjoy helping people plan what they're going to do and have basically have all their ducks in a row, essentially. A lot of people don't. So I saw a stat somewhere. I think it's like 40% of Americans or 45% of Americans don't have any estate planning documents. Wow. And I always like to be prepared for what's going to happen. I've had plenty of experiences where I was not prepared and things went sideways. And so just my personality, I like to have everything squared away before anything happens. I like to have everything in order, and I like helping people plan that. I like helping people plan how their families are going to interact, basically, because that's actually a part of estate planning. It's not just about your assets, but it's also about your family and your family relationships and things like that. So that's, I think, what really drew me to it. Like I said, I worked as a financial advisor for a while. So, it's estate planning is part of financial planning, really.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I think that's really what drew me to it. So, yeah.
What are so one of the things that prompted me to think, we need to get Ellis on was your video. One of your videos you posted on Instagram or somewhere like that.
Yeah.
About, you mentioned real estate law and estate planning. Part of the intersection of that, I think the question that was posed in the video was, should I put my home in a trust? Wasn't it?
Yes.
Something like that. Yeah. So can you go into that a little bit? Like what are some of the mistakes that most people make with their real estate, and how would you suggest they avoid those mistakes?
Yeah, no. So I think probably the best way to address that question is to go back just a little bit and talk about first get a definition of what estate planning is, and then move into that question. How I define estate planning is it's when upon incapacity or death, and it doesn't have to just be death. Estate planning also deals with incapacity. So if I'm incapacitated in any way, whether it's temporary or permanent, so estate planning applies to that. So how I define estate planning is upon incapacity or death, estate planning is you're directing where your assets go, or you're directing the management of your assets. You're providing for minor children that you might have, and you're appointing decision makers for your estate. So you're directing where your assets go, you're providing for your children, and you're appointing people to do these two things.
Yeah.
So as you can see in that definition, this has to do with your agency over these parts of your life, with your financial, your health, your family. It's your control and your decision making in regards to that.
Yeah. So your control once you don't have control. Basically.
Exactly. Your planning for when you're unable to make those decisions, your wishes are still going to be met.
Yeah.
And I tell my clients, if you don't have any estate plan, you still actually have an estate plan. You're deciding what type of estate plan you're going to do by not having one. When you don't have an estate plan, what you're doing is you're saying, I want the court and I want state law to govern what happens to my children, what happens to my assets.
Right.
Because if you die or incapacitated to a certain extent, the judge is going to decide who's going to take care of your kids. There's going to be a guardianship proceeding. The judge is going to decide. There might be someone who you don't want. You might have a sibling who you just don't have a lot in common with, through your worldview or whatever. Ask the judge to be appointed, and they get appointed. You don't have any control over who's appointed as the guardian. You also don't have a control over where your assets go. That's controlled by state law. So it's called intestate succession. So those rules control where your assets go. So you don't have any. So even though you don't have an estate plan, you do, because the state legislator and the court system is going to decide what happens to your assets. So you want to have control over what happens to your assets. You want to have agency over what happens to your assets and your children after you're unable to do that. Having a will, having the powers of attorney are definitely a good place to start. I think everyone needs to have those. You're going to say who's going to be the guardian in the will. You're going to say where your assets are going to go in the will. You're going to say who's going to make decisions for you in the powers of attorney. So that's a good first step.
So that's a basic first start. Is just like, at least you want to have it in writing where everything's supposed to go, who's supposed to do what, and
exactly.
So that is so that the state doesn't just decide.
Yeah. Exactly. And as you can see, you already have way more control over what happens with your assets and your children with just that minor step. So where the trust comes in is we're talking about control. We can talk about like individual control over what happens. With a will, you've got there's a lot more individual control over what happens to your assets. And I'll just talk about your assets because that's what we're discussing. With a trust, you're going to have more control. With the will, there's still some court oversight that's going to be in place. But with a trust, you're going to have a lot more control. With a trust, there's no, unless someone sues, but you can't really help that. With a trust, you avoid probate. There's no court intervention.
Probate
is what happens after you pass away. It is the process where your assets are gathered together. Your personal representative gathers your assets together. It's a time period where creditors can assert claims that they have against you. And ultimately, once those claims are handled, the personal representative distributes all your assets. It goes through the court system.
Yeah.
So you have to file with the court. It's all going to be public record.
And that happens no matter what.
That happens no matter what, unless you use a revocable living trust.
Okay.
At which point you don't have to do that either. As long as you properly fund the trust, which we'll talk about in regards to your house or any real property or any property really at all. So with a trust, you're going to have a lot more control over what happens with your assets. If it's properly funded, there's no reason to go through probate. When you've got a will, your assets are going to go outright to whoever you've designated in the will, as long as they're of the age of majority. If they're not, if they're a minor, it's held in a custodial account or trust account for them until they turn 18, at which point they receive it. With a trust, you've got a lot more control over how that happens. You can put language in there stating, I don't want any of my children to receive the principal, so the assets themselves, until they turn 25 or 30. When I'll tell this story to my clients too. I was a fairly hardworking, fairly responsible, as much as any 18-year-old boy can be, maybe. Yeah. And that's the point. If I had received $500,000 or $1 million or something like that when I was 18, I know what I would have bought. I would have bought a brand new Chevy truck that had a lift kit on it. I would have bought a bass boat that cost $20,000, and I would have, and just go from there. I would have bought a lot of toys. Yeah. I would have spent a lot of money, and I wouldn't have it anymore. So you want to protect your children from that. When you think about estate planning, and when you think about where your assets are going, think about it as the relationship isn't severed at the point of death with your children. Your stuff is part of you, as bad as that sounds, but it's part of you, and you're leaving a gift to your children at your death, or whoever you're leaving it to. And you want to make sure that you leave it to them in a way that benefits them the best. Yeah. As any parent, that's what we want to do. We want to take care of our children. If we want to leave a gift to our children, we want to give them a gift that's good, that will help them.
Yeah, right. It can be a curse, right?
Exactly.
Like money or whatever assets can be a curse.
Exactly. Yeah. And so you want to leave it to them in a way that it blesses them. And so if you view it that way, maybe leaving them a bunch of money when they are young and they're going to be unable to use it well is not a good idea. So that's where a trust comes in. You can put restrictions, controls, etc., on how those assets are distributed. Kids don't get it until they're 25. They don't get it until they're 30. You can authorize a trustee to make what are called discretionary distributions, or HIMSS distribution, is they're also known. HIMSS is an acronym that stands for Health, Education, Maintenance, and Support. And that trustee can, help pay for college, help pay for certain bills. But you're appointing someone who's older and wiser, who's going to help them make good decisions with that money, and who won't give them money for something they shouldn't use it for. And then when they're old enough, then they can receive the money and they can use it in a way that really blesses them and blesses, their family, your grandkids, great grandkids, whoever. And you can put, and really the sky's the limit as long as it's legal. You can put language in there. I have many people put in, if there's substance abuse issues, if the beneficiary is incarcerated, if they're in the middle of a divorce, things like that, the trustee will have discretion to not make distributions until those issues have been dealt with, whether it's incarceration, whether it's going to rehab and being clean for a year, whether it's getting through this divorce and making sure that the money doesn't become subject to this divorce and you end up giving a lot of money to a ex-in-law, which is not what you want to do. So you've got all these ways to control how your assets go to your kids with this trust. So as you can see, there's a lot more individual control over how this happens. Yeah. Which is where the property comes in. The reason I would say you want to put your real property in the trust is partly that. For a lot of people, their house is their most valuable asset. Yep. And so you want that to go into the trust to be distributed according to these terms. Also in Idaho and in Washington, if you have real property that's not in a trust, that's going to force probate anyway. Even if you say, I want the house to go into the trust upon my death, you're still going to have to go through probate. So
interesting.
That's a hassle and that's expense you want to avoid. But having that property in the trust means that, your potentially most valuable asset is in the trust, and it's going to be subject to these terms and conditions that you've put into your trust on how it'll be distributed to your beneficiaries, to your children.
Yeah, it's interesting about that probate. I just had a deal. I was on the buyer side of it, but the seller, one of them had passed away, and it was, the husband had passed away, the wife had the house, right?
Yeah.
But hadn't gone through probate. And it was like, we were supposed to close in February and we just closed like last week. Cause it went, it was like,
yes,
it was, how clear could it be? He left it to his wife. You would think that it would just be like a simple, easy, well, now it's hers. She can sell it if she wants, It's like, oh man, it bogged everything down for a long time.
No, I mean, especially if I'm assuming in that situation, they didn't get the deed updated and things like that because it didn't go through probate. So his name's still on it.
Yeah, I don't know all of their situation, but
I've dealt with that exact situation myself on more than one occasion as well, where I have someone come in and they said, my mom passed away but my dad passed away 5 years ago and they never did probate. And then, you can handle it. Obviously there's things you have to do, but it definitely, if there's a time sensitive thing, like you're trying to close.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're not gonna be able to close.
So the trust avoids that.
The trust avoids that. The reason is because when you transfer the property into the trust is now the owner, not the individuals themselves, in a sense. What I mean by that is you still own the property because it's a revocable trust, which means you can pull the house out, you can terminate the trust, you can kind of do whatever you want. So you still have every bit of as much control over the property as you would if it was not in a trust. So it doesn't make any difference. Like you're not ceding any control when you're using a revocable trust.
Yeah. I've seen a lot on ownership, on the tax records, that kind of thing, irrevocable trust.
Yes.
Is that kind of an old news kind of thing? People don't do that much anymore, or what's the difference there?
Yeah. So an irrevocable trust is, as its name implies, it's irrevocable. Yeah. So once you put property in there, once you set up the terms of the trust, it's not going to change, barring a few things that you can do that we don't really need to talk about because they're not really applicable. But what a lot of people used irrevocable trust for back in the day was for estate tax issues. Now, in Idaho, we don't have any state level estate tax, which is great. So we don't have to pay. There's no on the state level. In Washington, there is. And there is a state level estate tax. There's also a federal estate tax. And so in 2011 or 10, it's going back far enough where I'm getting my years mixed up. It was during the Obama administration. They raised the estate tax exemption to $5 million per person, and it's chained to inflation. So it would just grow with inflation going forward. Also, they introduced what's called portability, which is if you're a married couple, instead of a $5 million exemption, you basically have a $10 million exemption, chained to inflation from that time. The year before that, there had been no estate tax. And then before that, there was different estate tax levels, but it would get pretty low. My father-in-law remembers when it was, I think it was $600,000 was the estate tax exemption, which means everyone had an estate tax problem, and the rates were really high too. So if you were a moderately successful person who owned their house outright and had some assets, then you're paying a lot of estate tax. You don't even have to be rich. And the Obama administration, they raised it, and that was a good step forward. And then with the Trump administration, they doubled that as well.
Oh, wow.
So in the Trump administration, they doubled it. So that means, when the Obama administration had their initial estate tax exemption hike, or, that excluded all but an extremely small percent. I don't even know if it's 1% of Americans would have a issue with estate tax. When the Trump administration doubled it, that shrunk that number even further, as you can imagine. Now, that law is set to sunset in 2025, at which point we'll go back to the Obama administration levels, which aren't bad. They're better than what they were, that's for sure. But the irrevocable trust is a way to minimize your state tax by transferring property into it, you're effectively gifting property to an entity that is not you. So it's not going to be subject to estate tax. In a revocable trust, whatever's in there is going to be subject to estate tax. In an irrevocable trust, provided you draft it correctly, it will be out of your estate and will not be subject to estate tax. So a lot of the properties that you probably see with these irrevocable trusts are potentially vestiges of the days when
the exemption was much lower.
When it was much lower.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Interesting.
They still have their place nowadays. Even if maybe you don't have an estate tax issue, they can be helpful in certain circumstances, but people use them a lot less now. But there still are applications for them though. But yeah.
So do you recommend that everybody put their house in a revocable trust? Or is it the kind of thing where, wait till you're getting older? I mean, you don't ever want to do that, right? Because you don't know when you're going to die.
No, you don't. So that's very true. You don't know when you're going to die. I recommend for most people putting their assets in a revocable trust. There are certain circumstances where you don't need a trust. But there are more people could really benefit from a revocable trust than actually think they can. So take, for instance, we were talking about, the controls you have on distribution to minor children and things like that. It's one way you can think of it is the same as buying a life insurance policy in a sense. I'm not planning on dying within 20 years of getting my $1 million term life insurance policy. I'm not planning on doing that.
Yeah.
But if I do, then there's $1 million that my wife can use to, take care of the kids and things like that. But I'm not planning on it. And no one who buys life insurance, most people our age or younger, who've got a young family or younger family, they're not planning on dying anytime soon. And if they are, there's a good chance they won't get insurance because if there's like some terminal illness or things like that, the insurance company's not going to give it to them anyway. That's the difference between them and me. I'll draft a trust for you if there's a terminal illness and we're trying to handle your affairs. And that's happened before. I've had clients where they've had an issue where they're like, look, there's an illness. We need to get this taken care of, we got young kids, things like that. So you're doing that because once you have younger children, obviously you want, like I said, going back to leaving them a gift that will bless them, after you pass away. I don't want my kids to have the burden or potential curse, like you said, of having too much money too soon. And I'm not planning on passing away until I've got grandkids. So, at which point they'll be plenty capable, hopefully, of handling that money on their own. But right now, that's an issue that could happen.
Yeah.
So that's one reason to use it. The other reason is, ironically enough, it actually ends up being cheaper in the long run to use a trust because it's going to be a lot cheaper than if you have no estate plan at all. No estate plan at all is the most expensive estate plan you can have.
Interesting.
Because of court costs, especially if you have children. It's the most expensive thing you can do. I mean, a guardianship case can be very expensive. Dealing with an intestate probate can be very expensive. And having a trust, you avoid any type of probate. So it's actually cheaper in the long run than doing, I think everyone needs to do the foundational documents of your will, healthcare power of attorney, financial power of attorney, living will, HIPAA release, all that. And that's going to be less expensive than having no plan. But really, honestly, having a revocable trust in the long run is actually cheaper because you avoid probate and you avoid all those costs. So in the long run, it's cheaper, honestly. And then you've got all these other benefits and, it's just all the benefits of having the property in the trust.
What kind of, so for like folks who own multiple pieces of property, is that, does somebody put all of that into one trust? If they own things under LLCs, maybe they own a business, they own different assets all over the place.
Yeah.
Or is that all under one trust, or how does that kind of thing work?
So that really depends on the situation. Every situation is different, and exactly how it's handled is going to be a little different. And like you said, it depends on what those properties are used for. If you're renting property, if you've got a rental property, I think by all means have it in an LLC because of the liability protection that'll give you. One thing to keep in mind if you're someone who's in the residential rental real estate game and you're using LLCs, you should probably set up your LLC before you transfer your property into it, because if you bought the property as an individual, you've got your mortgage and everything like that, and then you try and transfer into an LLC, it'll trigger the due on sale. I think it's due on sale clause. And so the banks, banks are like, well, you're transferring it. I can accelerate the loan. With a revocable trust, that's not the case. If you have a mortgage, you can transfer it into a revocable living trust. That's not a problem. There's federal law on that. And the reason is, again, because you're transferring it to yourself. For an LLC, a single member LLC, it's kind of the same thing, but just the way the laws are, it's not seen the same way as a transfer to a revocable trust.
How does that work with your estate? Is there, somebody, I work with a lot of folks who own commercial properties and residential rentals and different things. Does the LLC, there's no protection there? I mean, so are you going to have to go through probate then to deal with all of those pieces of property?
If the LLC is not in the trust, it will have to go through probate.
Okay, but you can put an LLC.
But you can put an LLC in a trust. Okay. So what happens is the trust basically becomes the member. Is really what happens. You do an assignment of interest.
Interesting.
Of your interest in the LLC into your trust. Now, there's issues that could pop up there that are really more of administrative issues. A lot of it's dealing with banks, I found, because they're like, the trust is owning. I need to see the trust document. I need to see this. They want to see lots of stuff. I know of practitioners who they'll assign their interest in the LLC into the trust. Then if they're going to do a refinance or something like that, they just simply assign it back to the individual, get that done, and then assign it back into the trust, which is, not the easiest thing to do, but honestly, it's actually easier than dealing with the banks, to be honest, because an assignment of interest is like a one-page document. And in Idaho, they're not as stringent about having you update who's the owner on the Secretary of State. So they just take care of it in your operating agreement and things like that. But you can assign the interest in the LLC into the trust and put that in the trust. If you own it outright and I'm not going to deal with banks, then that's perfect, because then you just assign it into the trust and you're good to go. But that's how you would handle that when you've got a lot of real estate and they're in LLCs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are there any other mistakes that you see people making a lot, or that, nightmare situations with, real estate and estate planning? Or is it mostly like, hey, if you take care of the trust the right way, somebody like you helps them do that, then it avoids most of those problems?
Yeah. I mean, avoid making sure the transfers happen is a big thing. I try and, as much as possible, tell my clients, part of what I'm going to do is I'm going to help you get everything in the trust, because I can set up a trust and you say, all right, I'll handle everything, and then they don't. And then it's like, well, why did I draft a trust? It's not, it doesn't, depending on the situation, it might still be worth it. Again. So
you see that where somebody might have a trust, but they just don't ever bother putting their assets into it.
Exactly. A lot of the issues that I see people having is, if you're doing it yourself, you miss some key provisions, and whatever document that you think is going to work is invalid because you didn't execute it properly. Or I had a situation once where someone came in and their mother or aunt or somebody, I think it was their mother, had drafted up a will on her own, and then she didn't really fill in where her money was going to go. I think she told them, this is what I want you to have it. And then she didn't do it. So I was like, well, this will doesn't do anything. Wow. So, this money is going to go to someone else because that's how the intestate rules are going to operate.
And that's where you get into those big legal battles.
And I don't know what happened in that situation. I mean, they came in, I was like, look, this is what's going to happen. And they're like, okay, thanks. And I was like, I mean, if you need a estate and someone who's going to litigate that estate, I've got someone who can help you with that. But yeah.
So that's not something you get into, is litigating? I don't
really do.
You just do the planning side of it.
I do the planning side of it. I don't really do, and I don't do any litigation. If there's litigation, there's people I refer to. Sam Creason down in Lewiston, I often work with, or I send people that have got an estate litigation issue, but I don't deal with any of that myself.
Gotcha.
Yeah. One other benefit I wanted to note about the trust as well, like I said, going back to the definition of estate planning, it's not just death, it's also incapacity. And another benefit of having your property in the trust is it's often easier for the trustee to deal with people than it is for someone you've designated under your power of attorney. In my experience, I don't know if this is the case all over the U.S. in different jurisdictions, but around here, I found that if I've got someone who's got a power of attorney, validly executed, all of that, it's just often harder to deal with financial institutions or banks when it comes to that. So if you've got real property that needs to be sold or something needs to be done with it and someone has a power of attorney, it's often a lot harder when you're dealing with banks or title companies or investments or anything like that than if you have someone who's a trustee. I actually had a client once. We had a power of attorney, but this wasn't here. This was in Kootenai County. The title company didn't want to accept the power of attorney for various reasons, and we ended up basically having to petition the court to allow us to create a trust for this person who was incapacitated. The principal was incapacitated. It was his daughter who was trying to help him sell his house to pay for his nursing home bills. We had to get the trust to basically appoint her as a trustee and draft a trust after the fact.
Interesting. To
handle everything. And when you're a trustee, you come in, you're like, look, I'm the trustee of this trust. And they're like, okay, sounds good. Yeah. It's titled in the name of the trust. You're the trustee. You're the one we talk to anyway. Even though it might be the same person who might come and say, I'm the attorney in fact under the power of attorney. And they're like, wait. We need to look at this. I don't know if we can accept this. We talked to legal back in, Minnesota or whatever, and they said, no, don't take it. And anyway, so that might be more of a local thing, but in my experience, having someone as a trustee on a trust is going to be a lot easier to deal with anything related to real estate than it would if you're just a attorney in fact under a power of attorney.
Does it create long-term hassles for people in terms of like, I've heard different things like, oh yeah, you need to make sure your cars are titled in the trust, and you need to make sure, when you buy anything significant that it's owned by the trust, and is that something that has to happen?
Yes. So if you want to avoid probate, you need to make sure everything's in the trust. In Idaho and in Washington, if your personal property is less than $100,000, then you don't have to go through probate.
In total?
In total. So
anything, major personal property items you want in the trust.
Yes.
So that the remainder is less than 100,000.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And when I draft my trust, I use what's called an assignment of personal property affidavit, which is basically you're saying all of my personal properties in the trust. So I'm just saying, look, anything that I own, jewelry, household furnishing, art, guns, any personal
Pokemon
cards, all of that stuff is in the trust. That there's a little bit of a gray area with that when it comes to personal property that's titled, so like a boat or any type of vehicle or a mobile home. You could say that personal property affidavit covers it because those are all technically personal property, but I mean, it might be if you have something that's got some value, it's probably worth titling in the name of the trust just to be safe. And in regards to vehicles, it kind of depends on the vehicles. If you have a lot of vehicles, you're probably going to want to at least get a lot of them into the trust because if the aggregate of the value is over 100,000, and I know plenty of people.
It's like one vehicle these days. Man.
I know, it's true.
It's
yeah,
crazy.
Yeah,
it's so expensive.
It's a 2004 Ford F-150 is like 50 grand or something. Yeah, it's nuts. I think that makes sense. Like I said, you own a boat, you own a side-by-side or a couple ATVs, you've got a truck, you've got a couple, 2-3 personal vehicles. That's, when that's all added up, that's probably over 100 grand, depending on how nice the boat is, how nice the side-by-side or ATVs are. We live in North Idaho. Yep. I know plenty of people have got toys. Yeah, you got your side-by-side, your ATVs, your snowmobile, your boat, your jet boat. Jet boats are expensive. Oh, yeah. Someday we'll see. I'd love to get one.
We live in that place where they'd be handy.
Yeah. So I have got plenty of friends who've got all of these things, and so their vehicles are going to be over 100 grand. So you probably would be well putting it in. If you're someone who's got, we have one, 2010 Subaru Forester. And that's all we need because we live in Moscow and we don't really do much outside, and maybe then maybe not title it because it doesn't really matter, and the value of that's not going to be super high. But if you've got or if you have a collector's item, that's another thing you want to make sure is in the trust. But yeah, I'd say it makes sense to get those in the trust, unless you've got something that's really inexpensive and it doesn't really matter. Same thing about checking and personal checking accounts. I don't really see the need. Most people aren't keeping, that's not where they're keeping all their money, is in their personal checking account. They're keeping it in some investment account somewhere. And those accounts you should have title in the trust. But your personal checking at Wells Fargo or US Bank that's got between $3,000 and $10,000 at any point in it, I don't think those necessarily need to be in the trust. But you can put them in there. It's not wrong. Yeah.
So you mentioned Idaho doesn't have an estate tax, a state tax.
Yes.
Yeah. So is Idaho a good state generally to live and die, maybe more appropriately die in?
Yeah. Not if you're from California, stay out. No, I'm just kidding. Idaho is good for that. So I actually have a client who I'm actually working with right now, and they have a fairly high net worth. They live in Washington. They live in or just outside Pullman. They live close to the border, and we were talking about their plan, and they're exposed to a lot of Washington state tax. The estate tax in Washington is $2.25 million and change, somewhere in there. It's basically $2.25 million is the exemption amount. After that, anything above that, you start getting taxed, and you can, if you have, you can be subject to a lot of, even if you're not subject to the federal level, you can be subject to up to millions of dollars in state level estate tax.
Wow.
And this particular client, we were talking about it, and we were sitting there, and I was like, oh, we could do this, we could do that, and we got to use this type of trust, use this life insurance trust, and we're having to kind of figure out how we're going to mitigate all of these taxes that are out there and pay for those taxes and things like that. And we were sitting there, and at one point in the meeting, they were just like, well, we should just move to Idaho because I don't know why we're here. They've got like a vacation home over in Sandpoint, and they're like, well, we should just move over there. And I was like, yeah, that would solve some of these problems.
Now, does the properties, the property that's in Washington, let's say you own $5 million worth of real estate in Washington.
Yes.
But you lived in Idaho.
Yes.
That would still be subject to estate tax.
Exactly.
Washington estate tax.
It would. Any property that you own in Washington is subject to Washington estate tax. Mm-hmm. So, that's, even you put that property into a trust in Idaho, that's good, but it's since it's still in Washington, there's it's a somewhat complicated formula they use in calculating estate tax. It's not going to be, it doesn't get it taxed quite as badly, but they still get their cut of it.
Interesting.
The other benefit, so so that's one benefit, if you will. It's not the best, but it can reduce some of the estate tax. Another benefit to if you've got property in a different state, whether it's Washington or any other state, if you put it in a trust, is you don't have to put that property through probate either. So real property really in any state is going to be subject to probate in that state. So, I mean, it makes sense. You want to have all your property in your trust so you can avoid probate. The same goes for property that's not in the state. You know, if I own property in Washington and Idaho and I didn't have a trust, I'm going to have to do 2 probates instead of 1.
Oh, wow.
It's called ancillary probate.
Gotcha.
But if you put it in a trust, there are some benefits to it, but Washington they still get their cut of it. Same thing if you live in Washington, but you own property outside of Washington, same thing happens. It doesn't get taxed quite as much, but they still get their cut of property. So say you live in Pullman and you own property over here, they're going to still tax some of the Idaho property. Because it all comes to your net worth. And it's like I said, it's a kind of there's a formula they use for determining that. And it's a little bit, you don't pay quite as much tax on it, but they still, like I said, get their cut of the tax.
Yeah.
So Idaho's good for that. Yeah. No estate tax.
We're a good state.
Yeah.
Grateful to be living here.
Oh yes.
So where can people find you? Find your info and
Yes. So you can Google me. My firm is called Eifert Law Firm.
just spell it.
Eifert, yes. That's EIF as in Frank, ERT. So Eifert Law Firm. My office is located at 409 South Jackson Street. I'm in the old MZ building.
Yeah.
And I'm on Facebook and Instagram. Not as much as I should, I know, but it's Eifert Law. You can find me on social media. If you Google Eifert Law Firm, there's my website. I've got some resources on my website that will hopefully be helpful to a lot of people. And just whether it's even if you don't have real estate, you know, we've got a bunch of resources on my website that you can use in regards to either estate planning or probate. I do a newsletter as well that you can sign up for, where I kind of talk about various issues that might be going on, developments in law, talking about a particular topic, things like that. So
awesome.
Yep. That is where I am.
Cool. Well, thanks, Ellis.
Absolutely.
Appreciate you coming in. Super interesting and I'm sure it'll be really helpful for a lot of people.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. It was great.
Thanks for joining us. Like, share, subscribe. We'll see you next week.